Beletrina, v živo.
V nocojšnjem pogovoru bom predstavil knjigo Carolyn Forché, Kamnolom duš, ki je pravkar izšla pri Beletrini. Carolyn Forché bo tudi gostja letošnjih dnevov poezije in vina in pogovarjala se bova o knjigi, katere izbor je skupaj z avtorico naredila Kristine Kočan. Knjigo pa seveda priporočam v branje. Hi, Carolyn. Just told me that that you were participating in the selection of the poems for this very beautiful collection, together with the translator Kristine Kočan. Not all of the poems were selected by her, I guess, or did you just let her do the selection?
I believe she did the selection, but I might have sent her some titles early on, maybe, of poems that seemed to go well in translation, because as you know, some poems don't translate easily. There are, poems that depend on certain kinds of wordplay and so on. But it was Kristina's selection. We did correspond together regarding phrases and words and contexts, and she was wonderful. We went back and forth for a year, I think it was.
Mm-hmm. And in the end of this Slovenian edition, there is an essay where you recollect back to the time when you were writing in the house. You have a brick on your table and you are thinking of the house when you started to write and read poetry. And back then you were reading together with Elizabeth Bishop. She's the name whom you mentioned there. She must have been a strong influence on the whole of your generation.
She was. I think she's one of the most important influences among women poets on my generation. And she becomes more important and more influential as time goes by. Yeah. And there were, of course, others, but the brick was from the building at the university where I first studied poetry formally. And of course, it was torn down years later, and people who knew that I had studied there sent me one of the bricks from the building as a memento. And so I have it on my desk.
But back at that time, people, including yourself, were writing different kind of poetry. Before your famous collection, The Country Between Us, even you, I guess, didn't write so much of political poetry. You said that, I read in one of the recent interviews of yours, that this had changed completely, that America was very much against anything political in poetry back then.
Yes, I think that throughout the period of the Cold War, there was a wariness on the part of American poets. They evolved in such a way as to suppress certain subject matter from poetry. They were wary of poetry that was about contemporary events that might be read politically, warfare, and so on. And so the poets who wrote poetry against the Vietnam War, for example, were criticized for doing so in a very strong way. They were condemned for writing this kind of poetry. So when I was young, and I didn't realize it, I think I was too young to have actually internalized the politics regarding the literary proscription of writing about these events. But I began to translate. I was interested in poets from other countries, which was not common in my formation. Most poets that I came of age with were not reading poets from other countries very much. Mm-hmm. So I got interested and began to translate one particular poet, Claribel Alegría, from Spanish, and that work with her led me to El Salvador and a book that reflected my experiences in El Salvador. And that book was both praised and condemned in equal measure almost when it was published in the United States, because the poems were regarded as political. And there were people who celebrated that and people who were very upset by it.
And at that time, there was a civil war in El Salvador.
Yes.
You were writing about that, perhaps, and you went there several times in order to help the situation, I guess. You wanted to do to do something to change the world, as many people from your generation did.
Yes, well, we were very idealistic. And when I first went to El Salvador, I was invited by a relative of Clarival Alegría, and he became my guide and mentor. And I was there quite a lot between 1978 and 1980. And I had to leave quickly in March of 1980. Archbishop Romero, the archbishop who was assassinated, he was assassinated a week later, urged me to leave the country. And so I left on March 16th, 1980, and I did not go back during the war. It was too dangerous for me, but I was invited back to the signing of the peace accords. And then I went back quite a few times in the 90s to investigate the various killings that happened in El Salvador, killings of civilians, including the assassination of the archbishop.
And one of your most famous poems is The Colonel, I guess, from this first collection. And I guess this is like an example of what those guys that you mentioned and women of the elderly generation criticized as being too political in poetry.
Yes.
But I think if you gathered so much of this ugly experience, you sort of wanted to include that too, because if there is poetry, it should be the whole of experience. I think that's how I read it, not just because people like in a bourgeois sense might think poetry is something just for the soul, something beautiful where you relax, but your poetry contradicts that notion. That's how I read it, at least your early poetry very much.
I agree. I agree that poetry is also about the soul.
Yes.
Love, sex, truth, and death, as they say. But I do believe that it must embrace the whole of the human experience and the human condition. And I think for me, I was very fortunate in reading poetry and translation from other countries, because from poets in other countries, I learned this engagement with the world and with history. From Polish poets, from Greek poets, from poets from the former Soviet Union, from poets from Czechoslovakia, where my father's family was from. And also from South America. So this was an important education for me, this immersion in the work of other poets. I could read in French and Spanish. Recently, I studied Swedish to translate a Swedish poet, but I was really lucky because I had good translations and I sought them out. And these all became part of an anthology, Against Forgetting, 20th Century Poetry of Witness. And it was my response to the critics in America who said that poetry could not be political. It begins with the Armenian genocide and it ends at Tiananmen Square. And there are poets from there are 145 poets writing from 30 languages in that book. And they're almost in conversation all over the world with each other during the 20th century. And what they had in common was that they all went through conditions of extremity, warfare, exile, imprisonment, house arrest, banning orders, exile. And I was interested in how these experiences affected the poet's imagination. And so I gathered these together to try to learn something about that.
Oh, well, in this poem that I mentioned, The Colonel, you just depict a scene where they serve you or the speaker the ears for dinner, the ears cut of the prisoners. But I think it seems very ugly, but it might be just a trifle towards what's really happening in the world. I was reading it as a sort of imaginary scene, not too realistically, actually.
What it was a very nice dinner in the beginning, and after the dinner, as things came to an end, he got very angry. And the colonels, there were a number of officers who kept dried up human body parts. It was kind of a bounty. It was like a macho thing. And he just decided he was angry because I was asking questions about political prisoners, and he was really angry with the United States because they had started they had instigated a human rights policy. And so he was expected to respect human rights, which the United States wasn't really serious about at the time, but he took offense. And as an American, decided to tell me, basically, he wanted me to tell President Carter, what he thought of him. So this display was just a kind of take that,
So it's what really happened. It's not.
yes, it's what really happened, but it wasn't served to be eaten. It was just a gesture to scare me, to shock me, and to show me who's boss, that sort of thing.
But you said he was very angry and critical of the American interventionism in that part of the world. But you yourself were also critical, I guess, and quite often.
He wasn't, it wasn't yet, the Americans weren't yet intervening. In fact, they were refusing military aid at that time because of human rights violations. It was later when the war began that they abandoned that entirely and began helping the military government of El Salvador to prosecute the war. So I was critical of the military government of El Salvador, and I was also critical of American support of that military government. What he was critical of was having to respect human rights. So we were critical, but of very different things. Yeah.
But you were also, on other circumstances, you were critical of the American foreign policy, I guess. Although I must say, it's always from our perspective, we always get angry. Americans, if the Americans don't do anything, like why, if they are the policemen of the world, shouldn't they interfere? And if they do interfere, again, we say, and now they are bombing, committing crimes. What the hell? They should get out, like they did from Afghanistan now. So it's wrong. Whatever happens, if they intervene or if they don't.
Yeah, I'm finding myself in a strange position now because I've always pretty much been critical of American foreign policy, and now I wish they would do more, frankly, to help Ukraine, because I'm worried about that situation, and so I find myself somewhat in a different position now. It's very strange for me, because most of the wars that the US has engaged in, I have felt were elected wars. They were not necessary. And actually, I'm a pacifist. I'm anti-war, but I'm very much against this invasion of another country.
So am I. I'm very much a supporter of Ukrainian fight for independence, although it's a very dangerous situation. I mean, if
very dangerous
intervene, the World War III might start. We all know
that's right. It's very dangerous. It's probably the most dangerous period that I have known. I lived during the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis. I was very young, and that was considered a dangerous moment. I think this is a much more dangerous moment.
You also mentioned before the anthology Against Forgetting that you edited. And can you tell us a bit more about the selection of the poets in there? The included poets are from all over the world and from the whole of the 20th century, I think, till the end of that period.
Well, it stops with Tiananmen Square, and so I wasn't able to include the poets who were engaged in, Rwanda, Bosnia-Herzegovina, certain of the wars in former Yugoslavia, and so on. That was after I published the book. But what my criterion was that the poet actually had witnessed these things or experienced these things, meaning warfare, military occupation, imprisonment, and so on, because I was studying the effects of extremity on the poetic imagination. And some of the poets don't write about these events at all, but you can feel them in what they do write, so I chose them on that basis, but I was also confined to existing translations. I had to find works that had already been translated by poets who were celebrated in their own languages, in their own countries. I could not just go off and hire translators to translate poems that I wanted to include. So it was a collection that could be done at the time. And it begins with that motto by Bertolt Brecht, in the dark times will there also be singing. Yes, there will be singing about the dark times. So that is sort of the theme of the book.
Well, one of the poets that you translated yourself is also a Palestinian poet, Mahmoud Darwish. How was that experience? How did you run into his poetry? Was it when preparing, selecting material for this anthology, or did you find
Well,
it?
he was included in the anthology, and then I discovered that he wasn't really available in the US in English translation very much. And that's not surprising, given the American position,
Yes.
Israel and Palestine. So I decided I really wanted to find a way to have him more visible in the US. At the same time, I met some literary figures from Syria and Lebanon,
Oh.
and Munir Akash and Amira El Zaini, and we began to work together on these translations, and they were friends with Mahmoud Darwish, and Mahmoud said, yes, have Carolyn work on this with you. I had no Arabic, so they would make the Arabic versions, and then there were 4 Arabic advisors and me, and so I would try to do something with their versions, and then we would argue. And for every poem we would argue, and finally we would settle on the right poem, because it had to be a good poem in English, you know, which is, translation is tricky, it's very difficult, and especially with someone like Mahmoud Darwish. And I later became friends with him, I later got to know him, and it's a very great loss for all of us that he's gone. But I'm very happy that we were able to bring that book into English.
And his poetry also, the political message is sometimes hidden metaphorically, because I was reading some of his poems speaking about doves and stuff like that, completely allegorically, and then an Arab friend of mine told me, no, that's about how Arafat moved to, I don't know, Libya, and I didn't read it like that at all. So political messages are sometimes hidden. They intertwine with the spiritual.
That's right. And preserving both of those layers was what was important in the translation. But, you know, people could read into his poems too for what they were looking for. Mahmoud didn't want to be pigeonholed, meaning he didn't want to be put in a certain category. He didn't want to be perceived only as the voice of Palestine. He wanted to also be himself, and write about love, and write about loss of personal nature, and so on. So I think he's a complicated poet, but writing in an allegorical way was something that also the poets of former Soviet Union did during the time of Stalin, for instance. So it became a kind of way of avoiding the censors and avoiding political persecution by writing in such a way that people would understand, but on the surface did not seem to be a political poem.
Did you also include poems of Yehuda Amichai in your anthology?
Yes, both Yehuda and Mahmoud are there. And I had to
He's sort
write
of a counterpart, although also very good poet, but also political, yes.
Very good poet, also political. And what I had to do was I had to write an introduction to that section of the book. And so I decided, it was very difficult to write, and I decided I was going to give the introduction to both Palestinians and Israelis and see if they liked it. And fortunately, they both thought that I favored them, so it was okay. In other words, that it was, I hope, an all right introduction. But it was very important to me to have both of them. They're both very good poets. I also had Ezra Pound, who was a fascist. You know, I didn't disregard. There were poets who were communists, poets who were anti-communist. The politics doesn't matter. What was important to me was that they were good poets, translations were available, and that they had gone through these experiences. So this was what I wanted. That Gunther Eick, for instance, who was a German prisoner of war during the Second World War, one of his poems is there, from inventory, from the catalog of the things he had in prison. So I wasn't paying attention to whose side people were on or what was going on politically with them.
In your interview, which I read recently, I've also read that the notion of political that was almost expelled from poetry at the time when you began writing has returned to poetry actually after 9/11 in 2001. That was the experience that made America aware of political reality. also in art.
I think it did have a lot to do with increasing American awareness of at least their own vulnerability and their own participation in the world, and the fact that they aren't, they're not living in some protected, place under a dome of, what, but I think that the real acceptance of political poetry emerged with the emergence of poets, African American poets, Native American poets, Latino American poets, Latinx, they say, and Asian American poets. These communities that had been suppressed for so long, especially the African Americans in the United States, emerged, and they were writing the most exciting poetry over the last couple of decades. And so their concerns became the concerns of the poetry community. So there are many communities now, but the vibrancy, the energy, I think is really coming from poets who were not attended to in the past.
But then later in your development, I think you shifted slightly away from the concrete reality of life into a more allegorical sort of poetry, perhaps not metaphorically, perhaps allegorical and metaphorical is not the right way, but more spiritual, because somehow memory is the notion that became more important to you. Also, perhaps you can partly feel it in the title of this anthology, Against Forgetting, but I think memory throughout the development of your work is increasingly becoming ever more important.
I think that's right. It might have something to do with my age, and the poems are more elegiac now, and they concern other spheres of human experience than the political so much. Although there are a couple of poems in the recent book that touch on those subjects, but for the most part, I think there's been a turn toward considering mortality of the earth as well as of individuals, the times we're living in, to try to awaken an awareness of where we might be as human beings now, to consider that we are in severe peril in terms of our environment, and that we may lose our biosphere unless we change course, which we have not yet done in a strong enough way to avoid a disaster. So I think this is on my mind a lot, and maybe because I'm now in my 70s, I have other concerns than I had when I was younger, that could have something to do with it. But yeah, and you have to obey whatever is going on in your consciousness. We don't really determine what we're going to write about or what the tone is going to be, the form it's going to take. You have to just be available to the page, to be open and receptive, and allow the poems to come that come. And if they're about something you've never written about before, that's fine. That's okay.
And you also, one of the things that you like also in your poems are museums, apart from the primal natural elements like stones in the title of your book, but museums that are museums of unusual things. I read also in one interview of yours that you like all sorts of museums, as if implying that memories of the past might help us how to solve the problems of the present and future problems that are coming.
Yes, well, not only knowledge of history, but an appreciation of the past, and a way of falling in love with what we've done before, and objects that hold whole lives and memories, and awaken those memories and stimulate them. I began to take inventories of things that are no longer in use or are going away. Things that that humans made and used and no longer. Things disappearing from the world in Walter Benjamin's sense. Things that are passing away, and they're gone before we realize it. So I think I've been wondering what these objects mean, and looking at the material world as a receptacle of of energies and thoughtfulness and memory and awareness. So, and I really don't have a better explanation, because it's a little bit mysterious to me why I've been thinking about these objects so much. It's not
Well, poetry and writing should be a bit mysterious, also for the writer, I guess.
There are poems in the new book that are translated in the book we have in Slovenian that I'm not even sure what they are. I mean, they speak on another level. Maybe I'll understand them in a couple of years.
If there is a bit of irrational element of surprise, I think that's only good for poetry.
I hope so. I hope so.
But for the end of this conversation, you are coming to Slovenia to the Days of Poetry and Wine Festival at the end of this month. What are you expecting? Is it going to be a more spiritual experience, along with drinking wine? And do you expect any political debate? Because the situation now is very serious, as you said at the beginning, the situation in Ukraine, even the American situation with China. Now the president of the Congress, Nancy Pelosi, I think he was in Taiwan, and so on. Are there going to be, or what are you going to bring to the festival? Political debates, or are you, or will you, I don't know, try to influence people to forget about politics and just drink wine and let's get spiritual?
I'm going to be open to what happens with the group. I just came from Latvia, and in Latvia, it was a little bit of everything. Mm-hmm. You know, we had usually over coffee in the morning, there was political discussions, and then we'd say, no more politics. Let's have, a lovely dinner and let's recite poetry to each other. So a lot of things happen when poets get together, and it really depends on what they each bring, what countries they're coming from. But right now, I respect the grave concern of people who are nearer than I am to Ukraine and to Russia. And I am very worried, and I think about it all the time. And so I'm interested in what Slovenians have to say about this, what they're thinking, what they're feeling, what they think should be done, and what can be done. And at least in Latvia, there were these conversations, when they don't keep going in circles, they're very interesting. Poets have a very interesting perspective on the world. They see it in a little askew, a little at a different angle. And I'm always interested in what they have to say, but I'm open to what happens. I could appreciate the wine, and I can appreciate the beautiful energy that comes among us when we're all together, and also to be serious about philosophy, politics, the environment, everything that we are now going through.
Well, perhaps poetry, also your poetry from this selection of yours, can make this world a little bit of a better place, although times are very difficult for that. Yes. But I really thank you for this very pleasant conversation, and I wish you a very nice and pleasant and enjoyable stay in Ptuj when you come in about 2 weeks.
Thank you. I'm so looking forward to being in Slovenia again. Really looking forward.
I'm looking forward to see you there and hear readings of some of your poems.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Beletrina, v živo.